In this video, we discuss the economic efficiency of the competitive market. By economic efficiency, we mean a situation where all goods and factors of production are allocated to their most valuable use. Or in other words, when economic surplus is maximized. Economic surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. To illustrate the idea of consumer surplus, consider this hypothetical demand curve for parsnips. The demand curve shows consumers' marginal willingness to pay. Recall that marginal means additional. Anne is a consumer that is willing to pay $14 for a bushel of parsnips. If she only has to pay the market price of $8, then her consumer surplus is $6. This is the difference between what she is willing to pay and what she actually pays. This consumer surplus is shown by the blue rectangle. Consider another consumer, Betty, who is willing to pay $12. Since again she only has to pay the market price of $8, she captures a consumer surplus of $4. Finally, Carl is willing to pay $10 and thus has a consumer surplus of $2. In a competitive market where there are many consumers, the consumer surplus is equal to the area below the demand curve and above the market price. Consumer surplus shows the gains from trade for consumers. To illustrate the idea of producer surplus, consider this hypothetical supply curve for parsnips. The supply curve represents marginal costs of production. If firm A has an opportunity cost of $2, but is able to sell the output for $8, its producer surplus will be $6. This producer surplus is shown by the green rectangle. Similarly, if firm B has a marginal cost of $4, B's producer surplus will be $4. Firm C has a marginal cost of $6, sells its output for $8, so captures a producer surplus of $2. In a competitive market, there are many suppliers, so the producer surplus is the area below the market price and above the supply curve. Producer surplus represents the gains from trade for producers. The competitive market is efficient because it maximizes economic surplus, or in other words, the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the market price. Producer surplus is the area below the market price and above the supply curve. Economic surplus is maximized because in a competitive market, the price equals marginal cost when there are no externalities. If there are externalities, then the competitive market will not be efficient. An externality is an action taken by a producer or consumer that affects others but is not accounted for by the market price. Pollution is an example of a negative externality. If a steel producer, for instance, is able to freely pollute, then when she maximizes profit, she sets the price of steel below the true social cost of production. This leads to consumers wanting to buy more steel than is socially optimal and producers wanting to produce more than is socially optimal. When there are no externalities, then price equals marginal cost, and the market price gives consumers and producers the incentives to buy and produce the right amount. This is Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand that he wrote about in 1776 in his book, The Wealth of Nations. The idea here is that when consumers and producers act in their own interests, they are guided by the invisible hand to act in the interest of others. This invisible hand that gives consumers and profit-maximizing producers the incentive to act in the interest of society are the incentives that come from market prices. This graph illustrates the inefficiency that results from exchanging less of a good or service than the competitive equilibrium quantity. We call this loss in economic surplus deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the additional gains from trade that could have been achieved had the social optimum or efficient quantity been exchanged. If quantity 1 is produced instead of Q star, then the deadweight loss will be equal to the purple area in the graph. Recall that the supply curve represents opportunity cost and the demand curve represents consumers' willingness to pay. This deadweight loss exists because if production expands beyond Q1, consumers are willing to pay more than the producer's opportunity costs. So there are gains from trade when producing from Q1 to Q star. Producing more than the competitive equilibrium is also inefficient and thus produces deadweight loss. As production passes Q star out to Q2, the opportunity cost of production is greater than consumers' willingness to pay. Suppose that this is the market for wheat and the opportunity cost of producing more wheat is less corn. When we produce more than Q star, consumers value the corn they give up for the wheat more than they value the additional wheat being produced. An example of a policy that can create this sort of inefficient outcome is a subsidy.